St. Mary's General Hospital stood proud in a wealthy suburban neighborhood, its polished reputation hiding the storm that was about to unfold. When Angela Parker, a skilled and determined black nurse, joined the team, she had no idea she was stepping into a world where old prejudices still quietly thrived. As subtle tensions grew and the atmosphere thickened with discomfort, one silent observer took it all in from his hospital bed, a patient named Thomas Edwards. But Edwards wasn't just another name on a chart. Something about him was different, something powerful. And as Angela navigated whispered conversations and cold stares, his quiet presence would become a turning point. What unseen force did this patient carry? And how could one nurse's journey ignite a reckoning in an institution set in its ways? Let's find out. Help me with a like and a subscribe, and please comment what country you are from. Before we dive into this tale of buried bias and unexpected justice, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. And if stories of resilience and truth speak to you, don't forget to subscribe. The corridors of St. Mary's gleamed under bright lights as Angela stepped inside, the sterile air tinged with more than disinfectant. Despite her nerves, she carried herself with poise, ready to make her mark. But her arrival didn't go unnoticed. The nurse's station fell into a hush, eyes flicked away, conversations faded to murmurs. Swallowing the weight of familiar isolation, Angela pushed forward. "Excuse me," she said, steady and polite. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you point me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse met her gaze with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Down the hall, third door on the right." With a nod, Angela moved on the sound of her footsteps echoing through the silence like a challenge. As she neared the office, a tall man in a white coat stepped out of a room. His salt and pepper hair and confident stride marked him as a senior physician. Angela's spirits lifted. Maybe here was a chance to connect. "Good morning, doctor," she said warmly. "I'm Angela Parker, starting today." He gave her a swift, unreadable glance. "Dr. William Gaves," he said flatly. "I trust you've been briefed on our standards. We expect excellence." Before she could respond, he was gone. Angela stood alone, her hand still half raised in greeting, her heart heavy but her resolve intact. Taking a breath, she turned to the head nurse's door, her mother's voice echoing in her mind, soft but strong. "Baby girl," she had said, "you're going to have to fight. Twice as hard as everyone else," that's what her mother had always told her. "But don't you ever let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and that same strength runs through you." Those words echoed in Angela's mind as vividly as if they'd just been spoken. She remembered the long nights hunched over textbooks, the extra hours in the lab, the constant pressure to prove she belonged. There were the professors who barely concealed their doubt, the skeptical glances when she topped the class, the whispers from classmates questioning how she'd gotten there at all. But Angela never folded. She rose above every slight, every challenge. She graduated at the top of her class, her excellence undeniable, her critics silenced. Now standing in the stark corridors of St. Mary's, she drew power from those memories. She had fought through worse, and she'd do it again. The door in front of her creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone. "Miss Parker," I presume the woman said crisply. "Come in. We have a lot to cover, and I expect you to keep up." As Angela followed her into the office, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. This wasn't just a new job. There was something else beneath the surface, something unspoken. The hospital was clean and orderly, but the air carried tension like a storm waiting to break. Angela didn't know it yet, but her arrival would shake the foundations of this place. Her courage would force St. Mary's to confront the truth behind its polished image, a truth many had chosen to ignore. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forms, names, and rules. Orientation felt less like a welcome and more like a test. As Angela moved through the wards, she noticed the small things, conversations that halted when she approached, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, colleagues whose polite tone masked a wall of distance. Every attempt at connection was met with subtle resistance. She wasn't being outright rejected, but she wasn't being embraced either. By the time her shift ended, Angela felt drained, mentally frayed, and emotionally worn. As she packed up in the locker room, voices drifted from just around the corner. Two nurses spoke in low, hushed tones. "Did you see the new hire?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the neighborhood for, you know." Angela froze, her hand still on the locker door. The sting was sharp, familiar, and cruel. She had hoped the distant attitudes were just first-day nerves, but now it was clear. This wasn't just about fitting in. It was going to be a fight, a daily struggle against the weight of assumptions and unspoken biases. As she stepped out into the evening air and made her way to the bus stop, the energy she had started the day with had all but vanished. In its place was a heavy, aching doubt. But even as the shadows of the hospital stretched behind her, Angela knew one thing for certain: she'd been through battles before. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. Sitting alone on the hard plastic bench, Angela felt the sting of isolation settle deep in her chest. She pulled out her phone and dialed the one number that always grounded her. After 2 rings, her mother's warm, familiar voice answered. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" At the sound of those words, emotion surged up in Angela's throat. She blinked quickly, willing the tears not to fall, and spoke barely above a whisper. "It was challenging, Mama." Silence followed, on the line for a beat. Then her mother's voice returned, steady and sure. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of walking those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting those words steady her breath and steel her resolve. "I know, Mama. It's just, I didn't expect it to be this hard." Her mother didn't hesitate. "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, baby. But you've got the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high. Do your job better than anyone else. And don't you dare let them see you falter. You hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Angela said, her voice firmer now, her spirit rekindled. "I hear you." As she ended the call, a sleek black Mercedes slowed near the bus stop. Through the tinted windows, Angela caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves. Their eyes met for a brief second, his gaze cool and unreadable, before the car pulled away. Angela stood shoulders squared, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She might be facing resistance, but she wasn't facing it alone. With the legacy of strength behind her and a fire lit within her, she knew she could take whatever St. Mary's had to throw her way. As the bus approached, she stepped forward, not just to go home, but to continue a journey that was about to shake the very core of the institution she had just entered. In the weeks that followed, the halls of St. Mary's General Hospital became a slow-burning crucible. Every day added another layer of pressure, another reminder that Angela wasn't welcome, not truly. The chilly politeness of her first day had turned into a deeper, more calculated form of exclusion. It wasn't loud. It wasn't blatant. But it was constant. People who laughed easily with others barely made eye contact with her. Collaboration was withheld, guidance avoided. The worst of it came from Dr. William Greaves, who seemed almost to relish pointing out flaws, even where there were none. One morning, as the nurses' station buzzed with activity, his voice rang out across the room, sharp and performative. "Nurse Parker, I hope you've familiarized yourself with our protocols by now. We can't afford any mistakes." He lingered on the last word, letting it land like a threat. Angela looked up from her chart and met his gaze without flinching. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I assure you, I'm fully versed in all hospital procedures." He smirked, eyebrows raised. We'll see about that, won't we? Let's hope you've learned everything you need to. Here. The condescension in his voice dripped with implication. But Angela didn't flinch. She turned back to her work, her expression calm, her mind steady. He could question her all he wanted, but she knew exactly what she was capable of. The tone in Dr. Greaves's voice wasn't lost on Angela, nor on the other nurses who feigned busyness, but couldn't hide their curiosity as they listened in. As he walked away, the weight of their silent judgments clung to her like a second uniform. All day long, Angela found herself assigned the most grueling and undesirable tasks, while her white colleagues breezed through easier caseloads. It became obvious that the toughest patients and most complex procedures always seemed to land in her lap. Angela, would you mind taking Mr. Johnson in room 305? A nurse asked with a syrupy tone that barely masked her intent. He's been a bit challenging today. Angela nodded, even though they both knew challenging was an understatement. Mr. Johnson had already reduced 2 nurses to tears that week with his vitriolic outbursts, but Angela didn't flinch. With steady professionalism, she braced herself and stepped into the room. The moment he saw her, Mr. Johnson's face twisted with fury. What are you doing here? He spat. I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me. Angela inhaled slowly, steadying her voice. I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm more than qualified to provide your care. What followed was a barrage of slurs and venomous insults, but Angela endured it all focused and methodical. She moved through each task with precision, refusing to let his hatred shake her. When she finally stepped out emotionally bruised, but outwardly composed, she found Dr. Greaves waiting in the hallway, his expression painted with false concern. Everything all right in there? Nurse Parker? We heard quite a commotion. Angela didn't blink. Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Greaves? For a split second, surprise flickered in his eyes before he recovered. Well, let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we? As he walked away, Angela was left with the distinct feeling that she had just passed some kind of trial, one she should never have been subjected to in the first place. The rest of her shift blurred into a relentless stream of responsibilities and quiet indignities. She triple-checked everything, not out of self-doubt, but because she knew that one misstep would be weaponized against her. All around her, her white co-workers chatted and laughed, their workloads lighter, their days easier. The imbalance was undeniable, and every time she considered speaking up, her mother's voice rose in her mind like a protective chant, "Don't you dare let them see you falter." By the time her shift finally ended, Angela was exhausted, body aching, and spirit worn thin. As she retrieved her belongings from her locker, she heard the unmistakable voices of 2 nurses nearby. Can you believe they're making such a big deal about diversity? Hires once said, her words sharp with contempt. It's not like they can keep up with the rest of us anyway. Angela's hand froze on her locker door. Her hand still on the locker door. Angela's heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed to confront them, to defend herself and prove them wrong. But she knew better. Any outburst would only reinforce their narrow prejudices, giving them the justification they were silently craving. So she took a breath, closed her locker without a word, and walked out of the hospital with her head high, though the weight of the day bore down heavily on her shoulders. At the bus stop, as the sky darkened into twilight, the sleek black Mercedes pulled up again. The window slid down, revealing Dr. Greaves behind the wheel, his expression oozing with condescension. Nurse Parker, he called, voice syrupy with fake concern, waiting for the bus again. Such a shame. Looks like that's all you can afford on a nurse's salary, isn't it? Before Angela could even register a reply, the car sped away, his taunt trailing behind like exhaust fumes. The cruelty of his words struck deep, not just because they were personal, but because they were meant to reduce her. Still, she didn't let him see her crack. On the bus, her thoughts swirled with anger and exhaustion. The excitement and pride she had felt on her first day at St. Mary's now seemed like some naive, distant dream, replaced by a cold, gritty determination to survive. And yet, beneath all the frustration and pain, a quiet voice whispered something had to give. The question that haunted her now was whether it would be her spirit that broke under the weight, or the culture around her that finally began to crack. What Angela didn't yet realize was that change was coming, and it would begin with the very patient she was about to meet. As the bus rumbled through the night and the city lights flickered past the windows, she closed her eyes and recalled her mother's voice, firm and loving. "You've got the strength of generations behind you." Tomorrow, she would return to the front lines. And no matter what came her way, she would not falter. The next morning, Angela stepped into St. Mary's with a fire in her chest. She had spent the night replaying every slight, every insult, and using them as fuel. She reminded herself of why she chose this path: to heal, to serve, to lift others up. As she reached the nurse's station, something felt different. A wave of movement buzzed through the ward. Nurses scurried about prepping a room with unusual urgency. The air crackled with anticipation. Curious Angela leaned toward one of her colleagues. "What's going on?" she asked. For a moment, the usual coldness thawed as the nurse responded with barely concealed excitement. "We've got a VIP admission. Some big shot broke both arms in a skiing accident. From what I hear, he's someone important." Before Angela could ask more, Dr. Greaves approached, his usual stern mask in place. "Nurse Parker," he said sharply, "I need you to take over care for the new patient in room 412, Mr. Thomas Edwards, multiple fractures. I expect you to handle him with the utmost professionalism." Angela nodded, reading between the lines. Another test, another opportunity to prove herself or be set up to fail. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'll see to it immediately." As she walked down the hall, her steps steady, a strange sensation washed over her. Something about this assignment felt different. The atmosphere around this new patient wasn't just about medical urgency. It was charged with something else. When she opened the door to room 412, she saw a middle-aged man lying still, both arms elevated and encased in plaster. Despite the obvious discomfort, there was something composed about him, a quiet authority in his presence. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela said, approaching the bedside with a warm, professional smile. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay with us." Mr. Edwards looked up at her slowly, and in that moment, something in his eyes shifted recognition. Interest, or perhaps something more. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said, his voice steady and sharper than Angela expected from someone with both arms broken. "I appreciate your help. I must say, I didn't plan on ending up here after what was supposed to be a relaxing ski trip." As Angela moved about the room, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV, she couldn't help but notice the way his eyes followed her sharp assessing, but not in the way she had grown used to. There was no trace of contempt, no undercurrent of judgment. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity that felt almost disarming. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," he remarked, watching as she recorded his blood pressure. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" Angela paused, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Just a few weeks, sir," she replied cautiously. "It's been quite an experience." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, his mouth curving into a faint, knowing smile. "I see. And has the hospital lived up to its prestigious reputation?" Before Angela could respond, the door flew open and in walked Dr. Greaves, his face alight with a warmth so forced it was almost comical. Mr. Edwards, he said, overly enthusiastic. I trust Nurse Parker has been taking excellent care of you. We make sure only our finest staff attend to our most distinguished patients. Angela kept her expression composed, though inside fury stirred. Never before had Dr. Greaves expressed such confidence in her. Mr. Edwards, however, seemed to pick up on the performance. Indeed, he said slowly, glancing between Angela and the doctor. She's been exemplary. In fact, we were just discussing her experiences here at St. Mary's. For a heartbeat, Dr. Greaves looked caught off guard, but he quickly recovered. Well, I'm sure she'll tell you, it's been nothing short of excellent. We pride ourselves on being inclusive and supportive. Angela felt her jaw tighten at the blatant lie, but said nothing. Mr. Edwards' eyes, still fixed on her, tilted his head thoughtfully. Is that so? He said. Well, I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand. As Dr. Greaves launched into a long-winded explanation of the treatment plan, Angela couldn't shake the sense that something important had just shifted. There was something in Mr. Edwards' tone, in the way he looked at her, that suggested he saw beneath the polished surface of St. Mary's. In the days that followed, Angela found herself returning to Mr. Edwards' room more often than necessary. Despite his injuries, he remained sharp and engaged his questions, thoughtful and occasionally personal. He asked about her background, her path into nursing, her aspirations. Unlike so many others in the hospital, he listened without judgment or dismissal. His respect felt genuine, and Angela, despite her instincts to stay guarded, found herself opening up, if only slightly. Then, one afternoon, as she carefully changed the dressing on his arm, voices from the hallway floated in their venom, unmistakable. I don't care what Dr. Greaves says, a nurse snapped. I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do? Another voice replied, lower, but just as cruel. I know, but we can't say anything. They'll just accuse us of being racist. Angela's hands faltered slightly. Her breath caught. The bandage in her fingers suddenly felt like lead, but she didn't stop. She finished the task with the same quiet precision as always, even as the old familiar weight of suspicion and bias wrapped itself around her once again. Mr. Edwards, always alert, caught the slight tremble in her movements. Is everything all right, Nurse Parker? He asked gently. Angela gave a practiced smile. Of course, Mr. Edwards. Just concentrating on getting these bandages right. He watched her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was low but certain. You know, he said, I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they think they can get away with disrespecting. Angela looked up, startled by the weight of Mr. Edwards' words. His gaze didn't waver, his eyes sharp and knowing. I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Parker, he said calmly. And I can tell you the view from this bed has been illuminating. There was something more in his voice, a layered meaning that made her chest tighten. Before she could respond, the door swung open and Dr. Greaves stepped in his presence, effectively cutting their conversation short. The moment passed, but it stayed with Angela. As she stepped out of the room, her mind churned. Mr. Edwards wasn't just another high-profile patient. His insights, his questions, the way he spoke with her, it was as if he could see through the hospital's polished exterior into the festering truth beneath. And for the first time since she had walked through the doors of St. Mary's, Angela felt something stir deep within her hope. But hope, as she quickly learned, would be tested. In the days that followed, the coldness from her colleagues sharpened into outright hostility. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Glares lingered longer. Jokes turned to snide remarks, whispered just loud enough to be heard. The silent war waged against her was no longer subtle. Dr. Greaves, emboldened by the unchecked nature of his authority, grew bolder with each passing day. One morning, Angela was reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station. He approached with a thick stack of files, his voice as falsely sweet as ever. "Nurse Parker," he said, tone-coated with faint concern, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging, but I trust you're up to the task." Angela looked at the pile, nearly double what her colleagues had on their plates. Without missing a beat, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'll see to it right away." His eyes glinted with malicious satisfaction as he turned away, muttering under his breath, "Let's see how she handles this." From that moment, the day became a marathon of unrelenting pressure. Angela raced between rooms, juggling patients with complicated medical conditions and even more complex temperaments. She had no time to rest, no moment to breathe. But she never let her professionalism waver. Each patient received the same calm focus, the same precise care. Her exhaustion grew by the hour, yet she pushed forward, powered by sheer determination and the quiet knowledge that she was being tested again and again. Near the end of her shift, as she responded to yet another call light, she passed two nurses, whispering just around the corner. "Can you believe they're letting her handle all these critical cases?" one said, her tone sharp with disdain. "It's like they're just waiting for her to mess up." "I know," the other replied, sounding almost reluctantly impressed. "But you have to admit, it's kind of incredible how she keeps going. I would have cracked by now." Angela paused mid-step, their words cutting deep. A swirl of anger, frustration, and pain churned in her chest. She didn't want to be incredible. She just wanted to be treated fairly. A wave of quiet realization washed over Angela as she walked the corridor. Her colleagues weren't just complicit in the unfair treatment. They were watching, waiting, almost hoping she'd break. The weight of that truth pressed against her chest like a stone, threatening to crush her resolve. More and more she found herself retreating to Mr. Edwards's room between rounds. His presence, unlike the cold indifference that greeted her elsewhere, offered something rare. At St. Mary's Peace. Nurse Parker, Mr. Edwards, greeted her gently one afternoon as she entered to check his vitals. "You look exhausted. Is everything all right?" She mustered a tired smile. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards. Nothing I can't handle." He studied her with a depth that unnerved and comforted her all at once. "There's a difference," he said slowly, "between handling something and thriving. From what I've seen, you're more than capable of the latter." The kindness in his voice almost broke her. His words highlighted just how isolated she had become, how starved she was for even a sliver of respect. A lump formed in her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she whispered. "I appreciate your kindness." As she turned to leave, he stopped her. "Nurse Parker," he said, his tone quiet but commanding. "Sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to speak up." Angela left his room with her thoughts in overdrive. The meaning behind his words clung to her all the way back to the nurse's station. Something was shifting inside her and possibly around her. What she didn't know was just how soon that change would be forced into the open. The following morning, Angela arrived to find the hospital buzzing with unusual energy. Tense whispers filled the halls, rumors of a high-stakes emergency operation with hospital board members and external observers set to be present. The entire staff seemed on edge. Pressure crackled in the air like static before a storm. Halfway through her rounds, Dr. Greaves appeared, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of something in his eyes instantly put Angela on alert. "Nurse Parker," he said with calculated calm, "we need you to assist in this afternoon's operation. It's a critical case. I trust you're prepared to handle it." The words should have been a compliment, a sign of trust in her capabilities. But coming from him, they felt like a trap. Still, she didn't flinch. "Of course, Dr. Greaves, I'll be ready." As he turned away, she heard him mutter to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The next few hours were a blur. Angela poured herself into preparation, checking and rechecking every detail. When it came time to scrub in, she ignored the skeptical glances cast in her direction. She focused on the task, on the goal, on her purpose. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." Inside the operating room, the tension was electric. Angela moved with precision and calm, anticipating every instrument before it was requested. Her training took over, guiding her like muscle memory, her performance seamless and steady. But as the procedure progressed, she noticed something troubling. Dr. Greaves, usually composed and arrogant, seemed off, hesitant, his hand trembling slightly as he hovered over the patient with a scalpel preparing for a critical incision. In that split second, Angela's instincts screamed. She realized he was about to make a potentially life-threatening mistake. And without a moment's hesitation, she spoke up. "Dr. Greaves." "Angela," said, her voice clear and steady, "perhaps we should consider approaching from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." A hush swept through the operating room. All eyes turned to her, tension thick in the air. Dr. Greaves stared at her, his face flickering between disbelief and fury. For a heartbeat, she thought he would publicly humiliate her, dismiss her suggestion outright. But then, without a word, he gave a curt nod and adjusted his position, following her lead. As the surgery progressed, it became clear that Angela's intervention had prevented a critical error, one that could have cost the patient his life. When the procedure ended successfully, Angela could feel the shift in the room. Some staff members looked at her with quiet respect. Others, including Dr. Greaves, masked their anger behind forced professionalism. She had passed the test again, but this time in front of witnesses. As they began to clean up, Dr. Greaves leaned in, his voice low and cold. "Nurse Parker, I need to see you, now." Angela followed him out, her heart pounding, knowing full well the storm she had just stirred. But what she didn't expect was for him to lead her into Mr. Edwards' room. In the rush of the day, she had forgotten he was still recovering here. Dr. Greaves, too blinded by rage, seemed oblivious to the location. The moment the door closed behind them, he turned on her, his face red with fury. "How dare you question my judgment in front of everyone?" he spat. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot." Angela stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "Dr. Greaves, I was doing my job. The patient's safety." "Your job?" he snapped, cutting her off. "Your job is to follow orders, not to pretend you know more than your superiors. This is why people like you don't belong in institutions like St. Mary's. You're not here because of merit. You're here because of some forced diversity policy. That's all." His words grew louder, more venomous, his mask of civility fully gone. Angela felt like the air had been punched from her lungs. Everything she had endured, the microaggressions, the isolation, the exhaustion, seemed to condense into this one vile tirade. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Dr. Greaves." The voice was calm, yet unmistakably commanding. "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Angela and Dr. Greaves froze, turning to see Mr. Edwards sitting up in his bed, his face composed but burning with restrained anger. "Mr. Edwards, sir, I didn't realize you were awake." Dr. Greaves stammered, his bravado instantly collapsing. "I apologize if we disturbed." "Oh, I'm awake," Mr. Edwards replied evenly. "And I've been awake for quite some time, long enough to witness the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have been treating Nurse Parker." Angela stood rooted in place, disbelief flooding her. Mr. Edwards, the quiet man in bed, now radiated undeniable authority. He wasn't just a VIP. He was someone important. Very important. "There's been a misunderstanding," Dr. Greaves said, his voice suddenly brittle. "No, Mr. Edwards," interrupted, his voice firm. "There's been a pattern of discrimination, bullying, and targeted hostility, and it ends now." His gaze pinned Dr. Greaves to the floor. "Tell me, doctor, Do you even know who I am? Dr. Greaves, now visibly sweating, shook his head slightly. I don't. I'm someone with the power to determine the future of this hospital, Mr. Edwards said, his tone hardening. And right now, I see no reason to support an institution that enables this kind of conduct. The silence that followed was deafening. Angela felt a rush of emotions, relief that someone had finally seen the truth, rage at the cruelty she'd endured, and beneath it all, a flicker of hope. Dr. Greaves stood pale and trembling, the weight of his actions suddenly crushing him. He tried to speak, but no words came. Mr. Edwards turned his gaze to Angela, his tone softening. Nurse Parker, your professionalism and integrity under pressure have not gone unnoticed. Consider this moment the beginning of something better. Angela blinked, tears stinging her eyes, but she stood tall. In a single moment, everything had changed. What had begun as yet another day of struggle had become the spark of a reckoning. And little did anyone in that room know this confrontation would soon ignite a full-scale inquiry into the culture of St. Mary's General Hospital, bringing with it the long-overdue justice that Angela and so many others deserved. Fully upright in his bed now, Thomas Edwards fixed Dr. Greaves with a steely, unwavering gaze. I think it's time we had a frank discussion about the culture of this hospital. Don't you? The tension in the room thickened. Dr. Greaves opened his mouth, but before he could respond, a knock interrupted the moment. A nervous-looking nurse peeked in. Dr. Greaves, the hospital administrator is looking for you. It's urgent. Dr. Greaves hesitated, caught between confrontation and flight, but the urgency in the nurse's voice made the decision for him. With a tight nod, he forced out, "We'll continue this discussion later." Then, barely glancing at Angela, he added, "Nurse Parker, you're dismissed for now." Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the room in a heavy silence. Angela stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to breathe a sigh of relief or brace for what came next. Mr. Edwards looked at her, the sharpness in his eyes softening. "Nurse Parker," he said gently, "I think it's time I properly introduced myself. My name is Thomas Edwards. I'm the CEO of Healthcare United." Angela's eyes widened in shock. Healthcare United was more than just a big name. It was a titan in the healthcare industry, a conglomerate that held the fates of entire hospitals in its hands. Suddenly, everything made sense. His subtle observations, his commanding presence, the way even Dr. Greaves had faltered in his shadow. Mr. Edwards, I don't know what to say," Angela began, but he gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Please sit. We have a lot to discuss." Over the next hour, Angela listened as Mr. Edwards explained how what was meant to be a temporary hospital stay had become a window into a much deeper systemic issue. "I came here expecting nothing more than competent care," he said. "Instead, I've seen institutional discrimination in real time. Microaggressions, unequal workloads, and an atmosphere where silence is mistaken for strength. What you have endured, what I've seen firsthand, is not just unacceptable, it's inexcusable." As Angela spoke, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: relief. Someone was finally listening, truly listening. Mr. Edwards' face grew more serious with every detail she shared, his expression shifting from concern to indignation. "Your resilience is admirable," he said when she finished. "But it shouldn't be necessary. Perseverance is not the solution to broken systems. Change is." Just then, another knock came at the door. This time, it was the hospital administrator, her face pale and drawn, her posture betraying anxiety. "Mr. Edwards," she began, voice shaking, "I understand. There's been some concern about our hospital's practices. I want to assure you we take these matters very seriously." "Do you?" Mr. Edwards cut in, his tone, cool but laced with edge. "Because from what I've seen, The only thing taken seriously here is preserving an outdated discriminatory status quo. The administrator blinked, clearly unprepared for such direct condemnation. I'm not sure I understand. We have diversity initiatives. Initiatives are not enough, he said firmly. You need a complete cultural overhaul. And it starts at the top. What followed was not a conversation, but a reckoning. For the next several hours, Mr. Edwards laid out his demands for change. A full-scale investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training for every staff member, a top-down review of hiring and promotion processes. And then, with steel in his voice, he addressed the matter of Dr. Greaves. His behavior today wasn't just unprofessional, it was discriminatory, dangerous, and a liability to patient safety. I expect a formal investigation and appropriate action. The administrator, now visibly shaken, nodded slowly. Of course, Mr. Edwards. We'll begin immediately. Angela sat in stunned silence, 1,000 emotions coursing through her. Validation, relief, exhaustion, hope. For the first time since stepping foot in St. Mary's, she wasn't just surviving. She was being seen, believed. And with Mr. Edwards now pulling the strings, real change finally seemed possible. The implementation of Mr. Edwards's reforms began immediately. As word of his identity spread like wildfire through the halls of St. Mary's, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Fear gripped some, anticipation filled others, and for the first time in a long while, a flicker of hope began to stir among those who had suffered in silence. Angela, still reeling from the events of the past 48 hours, suddenly found herself at the epicenter of change. Colleagues who once passed her by with dismissive glances now approached her in hushed tones, some with awkward apologies, others with hesitant curiosity, seeking her thoughts on the sweeping changes being promised. It was surreal. She had once walked these halls as a target of scrutiny. Now she moved through them as a symbol of resilience. As her shift drew to a close, Angela made one last visit to Mr. Edwards's room. He looked tired, but deeply satisfied. Nurse Parker, he greeted warmly. I hope you don't mind. I've recommended you for a position on the hospital's new Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your insight and your lived experience will be essential to the transformation we're beginning here. Angela felt her breath catch, a surge of emotion rushing in. Gratitude, pride, hope. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with feeling, for everything. Mr. Edwards shook his head gently. No, Nurse Parker. Thank you. Your courage and professionalism reminded me of what healthcare is supposed to be about, making a difference in people's lives. As Angela stepped out into the fading sunlight that evening, she felt something unfamiliar, yet welcome, stirring inside her, the sense that a new chapter had begun. The road ahead would be long and hard, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone. What she didn't know yet was just how far the ripples of that moment would spread, not only changing St. Mary's from within, but reverberating outward through an industry long overdue for reckoning. In the days that followed, St. Mary's General Hospital became a storm center. Early Monday morning, Angela arrived to see news vans lined along the street, reporters stationed outside the entrance eager for statements. Inside, the mood was tense and fragmented. Staff huddled in corners, whispering, eyes darting nervously. The once pristine sheen of the hospital had cracked, and no one knew what would come through. As Angela made her way to the nurse's station, she caught sight of Dr. Greaves being escorted down the corridor by hospital security. Their eyes met. His once filled with cold confidence now held a strange mix of anger and fear. For the first time, he didn't look untouchable. He looked exposed, vulnerable, defeated. Angela, came a voice from behind. She turned to find Sarah, one of the nurses who had previously treated her with cool indifference. I just wanted to say, Sarah hesitated, her expression sheepish. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't realize. Angela nodded, accepting the apology, even if she wasn't quite ready to trust its sincerity. Before she could respond, the hospital PA system came to life. Attention, all staff are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory. When Angela arrived, the auditorium was nearly full. She slipped into a seat near the back, keenly aware of the curious glances still cast her way. At the front of the room, Mr. Edwards stood now dressed in a tailored suit, both arms still in casts, but his posture unshaken. He stood beside the administrator and a panel of unfamiliar but official-looking individuals, clearly representatives from Healthcare United. As the room settled into an uneasy silence, Mr. Edwards stepped forward and took the podium. The whispers died instantly. "Good morning," he began, his voice strong and unwavering. "For those who don't know me, I am Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I have been a patient at St. Mary's, recovering from a skiing accident. During this time, I have observed not only the quality of clinical care, but the culture within your institution." He paused, his gaze scanning the room, landing briefly on Angela. What I witnessed was deeply troubling. I saw patterns of discrimination, unchecked bias and behavior that undermines the core values of modern healthcare. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some staff shifted uncomfortably. Others, particularly those who had long suffered in silence, nodded in quiet agreement. "Let me be clear," Mr. Edwards continued, his voice sharpening. "Excellence in medicine means nothing without equity in treatment of patients and staff alike. A hospital is not just a building. It is the sum of its people, its values, its culture. And that culture must change, needs right. Now." Mr. Edwards' voice rang with quiet conviction as he concluded. "We don't just need policy changes, we need cultural renewal. And it starts with strong leadership from those who have lived through the very challenges we must now address." Angela felt every eye in the auditorium lock onto her. The room was filled with stunned silence. Then, an eruption of whispers as the weight of Mr. Edwards' words settled. He had just named her as St. Mary's first Chief Diversity Officer, a role she hadn't expected, hadn't even discussed beyond committee participation. She felt her heart pounding as a tidal wave of emotions surged: shock, pride, nervousness. But she stood, legs steady beneath her, and walked down the aisle toward the stage. She could feel the stares, some surprised, some respectful, a few guarded or even resentful, but no one looked away. Standing at the podium, Angela took a deep breath. The room quieted. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice calm and steady. "And thank you to everyone here. I know this is unexpected. Believe me, it is for me, too. I stand before you today, not as an adversary, but as a colleague, a nurse who has seen the best and worst of what this hospital can be. I believe in the potential of St. Mary's. I believe we can do better, not just for ourselves, but for our patients and for the future of this institution." She let her words settle, glancing across the crowd. Some nodded. Others leaned in, listening. Even those who had treated her with skepticism or hostility in the past seemed, at least for now, curious, open. "The road ahead won't be easy," Angela continued. "It will take honest reflection, uncomfortable conversations, and collective commitment. But I'm here. I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to work. And I hope you'll join me in building a hospital where every staff member is valued and every patient receives care, rooted not just in skill, but in respect and dignity, no matter who they are." Applause erupted. Some hesitant, some genuine, but it filled the room. As Angela stepped down from the podium, colleagues gathered around her, offering congratulations, apologies, handshakes. Some smiles were tentative, others heartfelt. People who had once averted their eyes now met her gaze. The energy at St. Mary's had shifted. Tension lingered, yes, but it was no longer suffocating. It had been joined by something stronger possibility. The rest of the day moved in a blur. Angela sat in on meetings with Mr. Edwards, and the hospital board helped draft initial steps for the diversity audit and began shaping the framework for staff-wide inclusion training. It was exhausting, overwhelming, but for the first time since walking into St. Mary's, Angela felt like she was making real change, not just enduring hardship. That evening, as she gathered her things to leave, she spotted Mr. Edwards by the exit, waiting with his signature calm smile. "Nurse Parker," he said, then grinned. "Or should I say, Chief Diversity Officer Parker. How are you holding up?" Angela laughed softly, weariness in her voice, but light in her eyes. "It's been a day, Mr. Edwards. I'm still processing. Honestly. It doesn't feel real yet. I know it's a lot," he said with understanding. "But I want you to know what you've done here. It matters. Not just for this hospital, but for every institution that will now be forced to take a closer look at itself. You have my full support. You've already done the hardest part, standing your ground when no one else would. The rest," he smiled, "the rest is where you lead." Angela looked out at the quieting hospital, its corridors glowing under soft lights. A place once filled with dread for her now held the first outlines of something new. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something better. As they walked out of the hospital together, Mr. Edwards turned to Angela, his expression suddenly more serious. "You should know," he said, "what's happening here at St. Mary's is just the beginning. I intend to implement similar changes across all of Healthcare United's facilities. Your story, Angela, has the potential to spark a revolution in how we approach diversity and inclusion in healthcare." Angela felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a charge, an opportunity to lead. "I'm ready for the challenge, Mr. Edwards," she replied. "Together we can make real, lasting change." As they parted ways, Angela looked back at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. Just days ago, she had felt invisible, on the verge of giving up. Now she stood at the forefront of something far greater than herself, a movement that had the power to transform not only St. Mary's, but the entire healthcare industry. The road ahead would not be easy. Change never was. But Angela no longer saw obstacles, she saw the necessity of the fight. In the months that followed, St. Mary's underwent a dramatic metamorphosis under Angela's leadership as Chief Diversity Officer, with Mr. Edwards' support ensuring the initiative's reach extended far beyond the hospital's walls. Mandatory diversity training, initially met with discomfort and resistance, began opening minds. Conversations shifted. Staff listened. Dr. Greaves, after a full investigation, was dismissed. A decision that sent a clear message. Discrimination would no longer be tolerated. As the hospital began to reflect its values in action, word of St. Mary's transformation spread. Angela was soon invited to speak at conferences and seminars, her voice becoming a guiding light in the broader healthcare community. A year after the day that changed everything, she stood before a packed national healthcare conference. A year ago, she began, "I was a nurse on the edge of quitting. Today, I stand as living proof, that one voice can make a difference." She shared St. Mary's journey, the pain, the growth, the victories, and spoke not of perfection, but progress. After the applause faded, Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered, met her with a smile. "You've come a long way," he said warmly. "I never imagined that my accident would lead to all this. But you've not only changed a hospital, you've reminded me why I do this work." As Angela returned to St. Mary's, the energy was different. The hospital buzzed with genuine collaboration, with empathy and respect. Sarah, once distant, now greeted her with friendship. In the lobby, Angela paused in front of a new mural, healthcare workers of all backgrounds, working side by side, a plaque beneath it reading, Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling. As she settled into her office, ready to take on the next challenge, Angela smiled. The fight was far from over, but this was no longer just a job. It was her mission. One day at a time, she would continue to push forward, changing systems, changing hearts, and reshaping the future of healthcare. Thank you for choosing my video among thousands of videos out there to watch. Helping me with a subscription of yours is very small but very big and too valuable.